So right now, today, we are doing an emergent session based on the feedback that you all have given us, because we're modeling listening to you and changing our trajectory where appropriate. So this was an open-ended one where we got to pick the topic based on things that we heard from the group. So priorities and topics for evaluation are our current focus. And let's talk a little bit more about how you might set your evaluation priorities, how you might pick something you want to look at more closely. So we're going to just take a moment to pause. You can pull out a little piece of paper, give you some time for some independent reflection. And the question I want you to think about is, what are you curious about? What are some questions and curiosities that you're puzzling over related to your program or your work? All right. The outcome for today's program is that we're hoping that you'll be able to identify a topic and a scope for evaluation in your setting. So the idea is that we want to support meaningful organizational learning and improvement. That's kind of the bedrock of what we're doing here. And so identifying a topic and scope is where we hope you'll get by the end of it. We'll discuss some evaluation topics that are possible, some different ways to approach evaluation, and we'll hear about some real projects that people have done, just to give you an idea of what's possible. And I think next I'm going to pass it over to Deborah.
So my job over the next few slides is to offer you some approaches to thinking about your program, your organization, whatever the body of work is that is yours and that is happening. And one of the ways to zero in on a topic is to think about parts that make up the whole of your organization or your program. So over the next several slides, I'll give you several ways to think about that. Some may resonate with you more than others. So I say if it resonates, gravitate towards it. That's fine. There's no need to use all of the ones I'm about to present. On this first slide, I did want to offer just a visual to think about how there is a lot of activity going on at all times to make your work happen. And these are just images of silhouetted human beings to represent that. So there's different work happening, there's different activities being run, there's staffing issues, there's educational efforts, all of that. So the first question really to ask yourself is, which pieces of those, where will I draw my fences around a set of activities that is the part I will evaluate? It's unlikely that at any given point you will be evaluating all of it. So Libby, you could click. I'm just trying to give a visual example here now. So for example, this is totally made up, but perhaps there's a particular curriculum you're interested in evaluating. And so it's worth taking the time to think through the different activities that are part of that curriculum. Click again, Libby. Or you might say, no, I want to go real specific. There's a tree field study within that curriculum. That's what I want to evaluate and understand. Or a different one, an identity exercise. Or maybe separate from that, you're interested in evaluating the staff training program, but as part of that program, you're actually training your staff to implement this curriculum. So you can see how there's like a little bit of an overlap. And I think there's one more circle yet, Libby, if you could click again. And so there might also be an initiative in your organization to employ year-round staff, and that year-round staffing initiative could be the focus of your evaluation. So this again is an image to just really help you think about where would you draw fences around the activities that you will focus on, and how might that change till another year you might draw a separate set of activities together to evaluate. Another way to think about the different parts is this process evaluation, outcome evaluation distinction, which Stephen covered, shared this slide in the first session. So we're coming back to it now. This idea that any evaluation might be more focused on the implementation which is also sometimes called the inputs and the outputs, the resources and the activities, the things that educators and programs do. So evaluation could focus just on that. It could focus on outcomes, like what's the impact of those activities and who is that impact on? So for example, what students learn, what they develop, changes in the community. And then there's also the option that you would design an evaluation that looks at both equally or focuses on one mostly, but gets a little bit of the other. So again, this is a way to think about your program in parts that make up a whole. Next slide. To take that idea a step further, this is a traditional logic model. I imagine at least some of you have come across this type of visual before as a way to think about program design. And so this just takes the process and outcome distinction into a little bit more detail. Inputs, which is in the yellow, is where a program would list the resources, the funding, the staffing that set the program up for success. Outputs is a word that typically refers to any kinds of activities and the participation of people in those activities. And then outcomes are often thought of as being short-term or pretty immediate. And then there's often harder to measure medium-term and long-term outcomes. And the idea with a visual like this, again, is to help you conceptualize how sort of the theory of what is happening. It's your hypothesis, like if we do these things, then we think it's having this effect. And evaluators use these all the time to design their evaluation. Which part of this theory or this hypothesis are we going to test with this evaluation? All right, then the next slide, I'm not going to spend as much time on, but I was really grateful recently to come across an alternative to that very linear logic model, which has many limitations. We know reality is much more messy. This approach comes from more of an organizational development lens and says really change doesn't happen left to right, it happens from the inside out. And so another way to thinking about your program or organization in parts and as a whole is to think about the internal pieces first, the leadership in the organization. Then how does that influence the organizational culture? How does that then influence project design and culture? And then ultimately, how does that lead to impacts? And then one final model. And I'm just going to take a breath because I feel like I ran through those pretty quickly. So this approach comes out of results-based accountability. And I'm really just pulling one specific piece of this larger approach called results-based accountability that I have found very helpful in thinking about evaluation. So results-based accountability helps us think about our programs as involving effort, which is sort of like the inputs or the out, particularly the outputs. That's the effort we're putting in, and effect, which is the outcomes or impact. And in terms of effort, we'll often think about the quantity. How much did we do? How many students did we serve? How many days did we run our program? How many workshops did we run? There are plenty of examples of programs that stop there. They sort of count their things and they report it out. That falls short of then saying, was there any quality to that? How well did we do it? So yeah, we did 180 days of programming, but did we do it well? And what does quality look like? Let's define quality and let's evaluate quality. And then finally, the big and really in many ways the hardest to evaluate, but the thing everyone's wanting to know is anyone better off because of what we did? That's the effect. And so I have really adopted these three questions into my own practice as an evaluator to think through which of these questions are we trying to answer? Are we hitting all three? Are we focusing on one? And so this is just another way to think about the parts of your program. And again, I inserted The outputs is really the how much and how well did we do it, and the outcomes is anyone better off? So we're now going to move into, with those sort of frameworks as possible approaches to thinking about your programs and organizations, we want to brainstorm topics that fit into these different categories of focus, or cut across. So don't feel completely limited by the fact that there's 3 columns. But on the left, you see we're talking about input, so sort of the left-hand side of the logic model, or the inside of that egg, inside-out model. Topics related to program design or outputs, and topics related to effects or outcomes.
So we enjoyed processing that together and hearing some of the ideas that you have for potential evaluation topics, your program, or for a generic program that you're interested in. And we also kind of went through that exercise as we were planning this, and we had some ideas about things that you could examine more closely that fall into those different categories. So I'm going to quickly share screen again. So here are some examples that we came up with. And obviously there are more. You all have come up with some really good ones that are not listed in our bulleted list, but things that you can examine that are related to inputs. You can examine your assets or your partners. You can examine your employee or your volunteer team experience, aptitudes, abilities, levels of training. You can look more closely at the board or decision makers and their understandings and competencies, especially if you're looking at that from the inside out development model that Deborah shared. You can look at the alignment of the curriculum. You could even use, for example, the self-assessment tools that have been created by OSU Extension Outdoor School before my time. Things like the CURSET, the Cultural Responsiveness Self-Evaluation Tool, which helps your organization take a deep look at your own biases, blind spots, and potential opportunities for growth in terms of cultural responsiveness in your own team and staff. So if you haven't checked out the CURSET, our outdoor school team put together like a staff retreat where we went through that process with Stephen's help. And we all, and we ran through that experience, and that's a great way to assess in sort of a qualitative way where you stand as an organization. We can also look at program outputs, program design, who is participating, what factors affect their attendance. You can look at participant feedback to see how well you are rolling out your program. What is the scale of your program? You can look at just numbers and quantity, and you can look at the quality of program implementation. Like, for example, what was the quality of the program that's happening on the ground at outdoor school? Or perhaps what is the quality of the pre-visit curriculum and the post-visit curriculum, and how well we are producing those outputs. And then you can also look at outcomes, which is amazing when you can gather information about the effect that your programs have on students, your effect that the programs have on teachers, or even the community as a whole, which would be an amazing story to tell. And this is where you can redefine your idea of what success is, which goes into some of the themes in our previous Eval PD workshops. What do we really want to see as an effect and an outcome? And if we could evaluate that, could we change our idea of what success looks like if we had more voices at the table?